April 20, 1945. Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. The morning light filters through the smoke that hangs perpetually over Berlin now, a grey pall that turns the spring sunshine into something sickly and weak. Somewhere above the reinforced concrete ceiling of the Führerbunker, that light is falling on a city that is dying. A city of rubble and corpses, of burning buildings and shattered dreams, of 4 million people trapped between an advancing enemy and a leadership that has decided they should die rather than surrender. But Adolf Hitler does not see that light. He has not seen natural sunlight in weeks. His world has contracted to a few dozen square meters of underground rooms, a concrete tomb that he shares with the dwindling circle of fanatics, opportunists, and trapped functionaries who constitute the final court of the Third Reich. Today, on his birthday, he will make one of his last appearances above ground. He will climb the stairs from the bunker to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, where a ceremony has been arranged. He will review a line of Hitler youth, children really, some as young as 12, who have been selected to receive iron crosses for bravery in the defense of Berlin. He will pat their cheeks, pinch their ears, murmur words of encouragement that mean nothing and change nothing. The newsreel cameras will capture the scene. They will record images of a man who looks 2 decades older than his 56 years, stooped, trembling, his left hand shaking uncontrollably, his face grey and puffy, his eyes bloodshot and watery. They will preserve for history the last moving images of Adolf Hitler, and those images will show not the dynamic leader who once commanded the attention of millions, but a broken shell, a ruin of a man presiding over the ruin of his empire. Within 10 days, he will be dead by his own hand. Within 2 weeks, the Reich he built will cease to exist. Within a few months, the full scale of the crimes committed in his name will be revealed to a horrified world. The death camps, the mass grave, the industrial machinery of genocide that murdered 6 million Jews and millions of other victims. But on this morning, surrounded by children who still believe in him, Hitler maintains the pretense. He is the Führer. Germany will prevail. The miracle weapons will turn the tide. Frederick the Great faced worse odds and survived, and the Third Reich will survive as well. None of it is true. Hitler knows it. Everyone around him knows it. The boys receiving their medals may be the only ones present who still believe, and their belief is the desperate faith of children who have not yet learned that adults lie, that leaders fail, that empires fall. This is the story of the final 10 days in the Führerbunker, a story of delusion and despair, of betrayal and murder, of the squalid end of the most destructive regime in modern history. It is a story that has been told many times, in many ways, but it remains essential to understanding how the 20th century's greatest catastrophe came to its end. It is a story of human beings, flawed, frightened, fanatical human beings, facing the consequences of choices that had seemed so certain, so righteous, so inevitable just a few years before. It is a story that begins in darkness and ends in fire. The Führerbunker was not a single structure, but a complex of interconnected underground rooms built in 2 phases beneath the garden of the old Reich Chancellery in central Berlin. The upper bunker, called the Führerbunker, had been constructed in 1936 as part of the original Chancellery renovation overseen by Albert Speer. It lay approximately 4 meters below ground level, accessible by stairs from the main building above. The Führerbunker contained 12 rooms arranged along a central corridor, originally intended for use as an air raid shelter by Chancellery staff during Allied bombing raids. The space was functional but not luxurious. The rooms were small, the ceilings low, the walls bare concrete. There was no natural light, no ventilation beyond mechanical systems, no pretense of comfort. It was a shelter, a place to survive bombing raids, not a place to live. But as the war turned against Germany, as Allied bombers reduced Berlin to rubble with increasing frequency and intensity, the Führerbunker became more than a temporary refuge. It became a permanent installation, staffed around the clock, equipped with communication systems and supplies that allowed it to function as an emergency command post. And as the military situation deteriorated further, as Soviet forces crossed into German territory, and began their inexorable advance toward Berlin. The decision was made to add a deeper, more secure level to the complex. The Führerbunker proper was constructed in 1944, carved out of the earth beneath the Führerbunker and connected to it by a steep staircase. It descended another 8 meters below ground, protected by a concrete ceiling more than 3 meters thick and walls nearly as substantial. The construction was rushed. Germany in 1944 had neither the time nor the resources for elaborate projects, but it was solid, designed to withstand any bomb the Allies possessed. The Führerbunker contained approximately 30 rooms, arranged in 2 parallel corridors separated by a central passage. Hitler's personal suite occupied one end of the complex. A sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small study where he held private meetings. The opposite end contained the machine rooms, generators, ventilation equipment, water pumps that kept the bunker functional. Between these two ends lay the working spaces of the bunker, a conference room where military briefings were held, a communications center where messages were sent and received, a dining area where meals were served, and various smaller rooms that served as offices and quarters for the staff. The total space was perhaps 250 square meters, about the size of a modest apartment, now housing dozens of people who were supposed to be running a continent-spanning war. The conditions were claustrophobic at best, nightmarish at worst. The ceilings were low, barely 2 meters in most areas, creating a constant sense of compression. The corridors were narrow, forcing people to turn sideways when passing each other. The walls were bare concrete, painted a drab institutional grey that absorbed what little light the electric bulbs provided. Ventilation was inadequate for the number of occupants. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Almost everyone in the bunker smoked constantly, including Hitler himself, who had given up the habit years before, but now tolerated it in others. The diesel generators that provided electricity added their own contribution to the atmosphere, a faint but persistent smell of exhaust that mixed with the body odor of too many people in too small a space. The temperature was difficult to control. The bunker tended toward dampness, the concrete walls sweating with condensation that formed puddles on the floor and encouraged the growth of mold in corners. Heating was inconsistent, leaving some areas too warm and others too cold. The overall effect was of a space that was fundamentally hostile to human habitation, a place designed for survival rather than comfort. And yet this was where Hitler chose to spend his final months, his final weeks, his final days. This was the setting for the end of the Third Reich. Hitler had moved into the bunker complex permanently in January 1945, as Soviet forces crossed the Oder River and began their final approach to Berlin. The decision was not made lightly. Hitler had always been a man of movement, of grand gestures, of public appearances that demonstrated his connection to the German people. His headquarters throughout the war had been mobile command posts, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, various field headquarters near the front lines. He traveled constantly, inspected troops, visited bombed cities, maintained the image of a leader who was everywhere and nowhere, always in command. The bunker was different. It was static, confining, invisible. Hitler could not appear in public from the bunker, could not be photographed addressing crowds, could not maintain the mythology of omnipresence that had been central to his power. Moving into the bunker meant admitting, at least implicitly, that the war had reached a stage where visibility was dangerous, where the leader needed to hide rather than appear. But the alternatives were worse. The Reich Chancellery above ground was increasingly damaged by Allied bombing. The Berghof was exposed to air attack and too far from Berlin to allow effective command. Other potential headquarters lacked the communications facilities and security that the bunker provided. So Hitler descended into the earth, and the earth became his world. His routine in the bunker was a parody of his routine in earlier, better times. He rarely rose before noon, often not until early or mid-afternoon. His insomnia, which had troubled him throughout the war, had grown worse in the bunker's artificial environment. The absence of natural light made it impossible to maintain normal circadian rhythms. The constant tension and anxiety of the military situation made sleep difficult even when he lay down. He relied increasingly on medications, sedatives to sleep, stimulants to wake, pills for his heart and his digestion and his moods. The medications were administered by Dr. Theodor Moll, Hitler's personal physician, since 1936. Moll was a controversial figure even within Hitler's inner circle. He was obese, poorly groomed, and regarded by many as a quack whose treatments were doing more harm than good. His injections. He gave Hitler multiple injections daily, sometimes as many as 20, contained a cocktail of vitamins, hormones, methamphetamine, and other substances whose effects were unpredictable at best. Other doctors who examined Hitler, including the surgeon Karl Brandt, believed that Moll's treatments were contributing to Hitler's physical decline. The tremor in his left hand, the stooped posture, the shuffling gait, the cognitive difficulties that became increasingly apparent. All of these could be symptoms of Parkinson's disease, as many historians have suggested, but they could also be symptoms of drug toxicity, of a body overwhelmed by the substances Moll was pumping into it. Hitler refused to listen to criticism of Moll. The doctor made him feel better, he said. The injections gave him energy. He trusted Moll, and trust was a commodity in increasingly short supply as the war reached its climax. When Hitler did rise, usually in early afternoon, he received military briefings in the bunker's small conference room. The briefings followed a pattern that had been established years before, in better times when there was actually good news to report. Officers would present the day's situation: front lines, troop movements, supply situations, casualty figures. Maps were spread on the table, marked with symbols representing armies and corps and divisions. Reports were read, questions were asked, orders were given. But the substance of these briefings had changed utterly since the early years of the war. In 1940, in 1941, the briefings had been occasions for celebration. German forces were advancing across Europe, conquering nations in weeks that had resisted for years in the previous war. The maps showed arrows pointing outward offensive operations that expanded the Reich's territory daily. The reports were of victories, of captured cities, of enemy armies destroyed. Now the arrows all pointed inward. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, having crossed Poland and entered German territory. Western Allied forces were advancing from the west, having crossed the Rhine and penetrated deep into the German heartland. The Reich was shrinking daily, squeezed between enemies that possessed overwhelming superiority in every category. The reports were of disasters, cities lost, divisions destroyed, supply lines cut, casualties mounting at rates that made replacement impossible. The German military machine, once the most formidable in the world, was being ground to pieces by enemies who could replace their losses and Germans who could not. Hitler responded to these reports with a mixture of denial, rage, and fantasy. The denial was reflexive, almost automatic. He refused to accept that the situation was as bad as his generals described. He accused them of defeatism, of exaggeration, of deliberately misrepresenting the facts to justify their failures. He demanded that bad news be verified, rechecked, confirmed by multiple sources, not because he wanted accuracy, but because he hoped that verification would reveal the news to be less bad than initially reported. The rage was explosive and unpredictable. Hitler had always had a volatile temper, but in the bunker his rages became more frequent and more intense. He screamed at generals, cursed their incompetence, threatened them with courts-martial and execution. He threw objects, pounded tables, worked himself into states of such fury that witnesses feared he would have a stroke or a heart attack. The fantasy was perhaps the most disturbing element. Hitler continued to believe, or at least to assert, that the situation could be retrieved. Armies that had been destroyed would be reconstituted. New weapons would appear and change the balance of power. The alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union would collapse, and Germany would be able to make peace with one side while continuing to fight the other. None of this was remotely plausible. The armies Hitler ordered into action often existed only on paper. Their unit designations still appeared on the maps, but the actual soldiers and equipment had been destroyed or captured. The wonder weapons he anticipated, jet aircraft, new submarines, long-range missiles, existed in too few numbers and arrived too late to affect the outcome. The enemy alliance showed no signs of cracking. If anything, the approach of victory was strengthening the bonds between powers that had little in common except their determination to destroy Nazi Germany. But Hitler continued to insist that victory was possible, and his subordinates continued to nod and agree, because disagreement meant accusations of treason, and accusations of treason could mean death. After the briefings, Hitler would eat a late lunch, usually with Eva Braun and one or two other intimates. His diet had become increasingly restricted over the years. He was a vegetarian who had once enjoyed explaining his dietary philosophy to captive audiences, discoursing at length on the health benefits of avoiding meat, the moral superiority of plant-based eating, the connection between diet and spiritual purity. Now he ate mechanically, without pleasure, selecting from a limited menu of vegetables, pasta, and pastries that his damaged digestion could tolerate. He suffered from chronic stomach pain, from bloating and gas that he attributed to his diet, but that may have been caused by the stress of his situation or the medications he was taking. Meals were functional rather than social, interruptions in the day rather than occasions for enjoyment. The evenings brought more meetings, more discussions, more opportunities for Hitler to hold forth on his favorite subjects. He talked endlessly. The monologues that had characterized his dinner parties in better times continued in the bunker, but now they were delivered to audiences that were smaller, more captive, more exhausted. He talked about history, drawing parallels between his situation and that of Frederick the Great, who had faced seemingly impossible odds in the 7 Years' War and survived. He talked about architecture, describing the buildings he would construct after the war, the transformation of Berlin into Germania, the world capital of a 1,000-year Reich. He talked about his plans for the post-war world, plans that assumed a German victory, that assumed the survival of the regime, that assumed a future that every rational observer knew would never come. He described the resettlement of conquered territories, the reorganization of Europe under German leadership, the construction of a new civilization that would last for millennia. The listeners sat through these performances because they had no choice. Contradicting Hitler was dangerous. Even expressing doubt could provoke an explosion of rage. So they nodded and agreed, made supportive noises, waited for the monologue to end so they could return to their own concerns. Many of them no longer believed a word he said. They knew the war was lost, knew that the future Hitler described was pure fantasy. But they continued to listen, continued to nod, because the alternative was to challenge a man who still held the power of life and death over everyone in the bunker. The outside world rarely intruded on this artificial environment. The bunker had communications equipment, radio transmitters, telephone lines, teletype machines, that theoretically connected it to the German military command structure and to the outside world. But these connections were increasingly unreliable. Bombing had destroyed many of the relay stations. Soviet advances had cut landlines. The chaos of the military situation meant that orders issued from the bunker often failed to reach their intended recipients. Radio reports were filtered through Goebbels's propaganda ministry, which continued to broadcast claims of German victories and minimized the scope of German defeats. The reports bore little relationship to reality, but they were often the only information available, and some of those in the bunker may have half believed them even as they knew intellectually that they were lies. Visitors from the surface brought news, but that news was immediately reinterpreted through the lens of Hitler's delusions. Generals who reported honestly about the military situation were accused of defeatism. Officials who described the destruction of German cities were dismissed as pessimists. The bunker became an echo chamber in which reality was excluded and fantasy was reinforced. The bombing and shelling were constant. Allied aircraft by day, Soviet artillery by night, the government district under attack around the clock. Each impact sent tremors through the bunker, shook dust from the ceiling, reminded everyone that the world above was being destroyed. But the bunker's thick concrete walls reduced these impacts to distant thuds, background noise that became unremarkable through repetition. Hitler could ignore the destruction of his capital because he didn't have to see it, hear it, smell it. His war had become abstract, numbers on maps, reports read aloud by subordinates, completely disconnected from the human reality of death and destruction. The population of the bunker fluctuated throughout April as circumstances changed and individuals came and went. Some left, ordered away on missions that may or may not have been sincere attempts to accomplish military objectives. Some arrived, summoned for meetings or seeking shelter from the chaos above. The core group remained constant, but the supporting cast changed daily. At the center of everything was Hitler himself, around whom the entire bunker revolved. He was not just the political leader, but the emotional center, the focus of attention, the person whose moods and decisions shaped the experience of everyone else. When Hitler was calm, which became increasingly rare, the bunker functioned with something approaching normality. Work was done, meals were eaten, conversations were held. But when Hitler raged, which became increasingly common, everything stopped. Everyone waited for the storm to pass, walking on eggshells, avoiding anything that might trigger another explosion. The inner circle who remained with Hitler to the end consisted of a small group of true believers, opportunists, and people who had nowhere else to go. Eva Braun was the most unexpected member of this group. She had arrived in Berlin on April 15, traveling from Munich against Hitler's explicit orders to stay away from the doomed capital. She was 33 years old, blonde and athletic, the companion Hitler had kept hidden from public view for more than 15 years. Their relationship was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Third Reich. The German public knew nothing of Eva Braun. She never appeared with Hitler in public, never attended official functions, never acknowledged her connection to him in any way that might reach the outside world. Hitler believed that the Führer should appear married to Germany itself, devoted entirely to the nation rather than distracted by personal attachments. A public relationship would have undermined this image, would have made him seem ordinary, human, subject to the same romantic needs as everyone else. So Eva remained in the shadows. She lived in Hitler's residences, the Burghof in Bavaria, the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, but always in a separate wing, always invisible when visitors arrived. She attended Hitler's private social gatherings, but disappeared when official business intruded. She loved him, or believed she did, and she accepted the terms of a relationship that gave her almost nothing in return. Now, with the Reich collapsing, she had come to Berlin to be with him at the end. Hitler had tried repeatedly to send her away. He arranged transportation, urged her to flee to Bavaria, promised that he would follow when the military situation permitted. He did not want her to die in Berlin, did not want anyone he cared about to die there, and he made his wishes clear. Eva refused. If he was going to die in Berlin, she would die with him. It was, she reportedly told those around her, what she had always wanted, to be with him completely, without reservation, until the end. The circumstances that made this possible, the collapse of the Reich, the siege of Berlin, the approach of death, were almost incidental. What mattered was that she would finally, permanently, have him to herself. Her presence in the bunker was initially awkward. She had no official role, no clear position in the hierarchy. She was not Hitler's wife, so she had no status. She was not even officially acknowledged as his companion. She was simply there, occupying rooms in the Führerbunker, trying to maintain some semblance of normal life in a setting that was anything but normal. She dressed carefully each day, selecting clothes and applying makeup as though she were preparing for a social engagement rather than an apocalypse. She held small gatherings in her rooms, serving drinks and making conversation with the younger officers and staff members who were trapped in the bunker. She danced to gramophone music while artillery shells shook the ceiling above. Some historians have interpreted this behavior as denial, an inability or unwillingness to accept the reality of the situation. The world was ending, and Eva Braun was hosting cocktail parties. It seems absurd, disconnected from reality, almost pathological in its refusal to acknowledge circumstances. But other interpretations are possible. Perhaps Eva understood perfectly well what was happening and chose to maintain normality as a form of resistance, a refusal to let the circumstances rob her of dignity and humanity. Perhaps the cocktail parties and the careful grooming were her way of asserting control over the one thing she could control, her own behavior, in a situation where everything else was out of control. Perhaps she simply didn't know what else to do. She was not a politician or a soldier. She had no role in the military operations or the political decisions that were shaping the bunker's final days. She was there to be with Hitler, and when he was in meetings or conferences, she had to find something to do with herself. Whatever her psychology, her presence affected the atmosphere in subtle ways. She was the only woman in Hitler's immediate circle, the only person there for personal rather than professional reasons. Her domesticity, the attention to appearance, the social rituals, the feminine touches she brought to the concrete environment, created pockets of normalcy in a setting defined by abnormality. Martin Bormann was another constant presence in the bunker, and his motivations were far less romantic than Eva's. Bormann was Hitler's private secretary and the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery. He had accumulated enormous power during the war years by controlling access to Hitler, by managing the flow of information that reached the Führer, by making himself indispensable to the daily operations of the dictatorship. He was widely despised by other Nazi leaders. Goering hated him. Goebbels hated him. Himmler hated him. Speer hated him. They saw him as a schemer and a manipulator, a man who had risen not through ability or loyalty, but through cunning and ruthlessness. And they were not entirely wrong. Bormann was cunning and ruthless. He had built his power by working harder than anyone else, by being always available, by anticipating Hitler's needs and meeting them before they were expressed. He had undermined rivals, blocked access to the Führer, shaped decisions by controlling the information on which those decisions were based. But Bormann was also genuinely devoted to Hitler, or at least as devoted as a man of his calculating nature could be to anyone. He believed in the Nazi cause, believed in Hitler's leadership, believed that the Reich could still be saved if only the right decisions were made. His presence in the bunker was not just about preserving his own power, though it was certainly about that, but also about serving the leader he had followed for years. In the bunker's final days, Bormann continued to work. He sent messages, drafted orders, maintained the bureaucratic machinery of the regime, even as the regime itself was collapsing. He was present at every meeting, took notes on every decision, positioned himself to remain important regardless of what happened next. He was also positioning himself to survive. Unlike some of the true believers in the bunker, Bormann had no intention of dying with Hitler. He was making plans, cultivating contacts, preparing for a breakout that might allow him to escape the bunker and eventually escape Germany altogether. Whether he would succeed remained to be seen. Joseph Goebbels occupied a different position in the bunker hierarchy. He was the Reich Minister of Propaganda, the man who had done more than anyone except Hitler himself to create and sustain the Nazi mythology. His voice had been heard by millions of Germans through radio broadcasts that mixed lies with enough truth to seem credible. His newspapers and films had shaped public opinion, had justified the war, had prepared the population for sacrifices that seemed endless. Now, with the end approaching, Goebbels had made a decision that set him apart from most of the other Nazi leaders. He had decided to die, unlike Goering, who had fled Berlin, unlike Himmler, who was negotiating secretly with the Allies, unlike the countless officials and officers who were making arrangements for surrender or escape. Goebbels intended to remain in the bunker, to share Hitler's fate, to die as a martyr to the cause he had served. And he had brought his family with him. Magda Goebbels and their 6 children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig and Heidrun, ranging in age from 4 to 12, occupied rooms in the Führerbunker above Hitler's quarters. The children played in the corridors, seemingly oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding around them. They had been told they were on an adventure, a special trip to Uncle Adolf's house, and they accepted this explanation with the trust that children give to parents. Magda was more complicated. She knew what was coming. She understood what her husband had decided, and she had made her own decision, a decision that would become one of the most disturbing elements of the bunker's final days. She would not allow her children to survive into a world without National Socialism. She could not bear for them to grow up under Allied occupation, to be raised in a society that condemned everything their parents had believed in, to carry the stigma of the Goebbels name through lives defined by their father's role in the regime. Better that they should die now, innocent and uncorrupted, than live in the world that was coming. She had discussed this decision with her husband, and he had agreed. They would die together, as a family, when the time came. The children would go first, spared the knowledge of what was happening, spared the suffering that survival might bring. It was monstrous. It was, in its own twisted way, an act of love. It was the logical conclusion of an ideology that had always valued death over compromise, that had always preferred destruction to surrender. The children played in the bunker corridors, unaware that their parents had already decided to kill them. Albert Speer was a more ambivalent presence in the bunker. He was Hitler's personal architect, the man who had designed the Nazi Party rally grounds at Nuremberg and was supposed to transform Berlin into Germania, the world capital of the Reich. He was also the Minister of Armaments, responsible for keeping German war production functioning despite Allied bombing and resource shortages. Speer had been one of Hitler's closest associates for years, perhaps the closest thing Hitler had to a genuine friend. They had spent hours together discussing architecture, sharing dreams of the buildings they would construct, the cities they would create, the physical monuments that would outlast them both. But the relationship had cooled as the war progressed. Speer had become increasingly skeptical of Hitler's military decisions, increasingly aware that the war was lost, increasingly unwilling to execute orders that seemed designed to destroy Germany rather than save it. The breaking point came with the Nero Decree. In March 1945, Hitler had issued orders for the destruction of German infrastructure, bridges, factories, power plants, transportation networks, everything that might be useful to the enemy after Germany's defeat. The order reflected Hitler's belief that if Germany could not win the war, Germany deserved to perish. The German people had proven unworthy of their leader. They would suffer the consequences. Speer was appalled. The destruction that Hitler ordered would not affect the war's outcome. The war was already lost, but it would devastate Germany's ability to recover after the war ended. Millions of Germans would starve, freeze, die of diseases that could have been prevented if infrastructure remained intact. He decided to sabotage the order. Working quietly, using his authority as armaments minister, he countermanded destruction orders, persuaded local commanders to delay or ignore Hitler's directives, preserved what could be preserved without openly defying the Führer. It was an act of extraordinary courage, or perhaps extraordinary presumption. One man deciding that he knew better than his leader, that his judgment should override Hitler's orders, that Germany's future mattered more than obedience to the regime. Speer visited the bunker several times in April, for what both he and Hitler knew might be their final meetings. The atmosphere was charged with unspoken tensions. Hitler may have suspected Speer's sabotage. Rumors had reached the bunker, but he did not confront his former friend directly. Their conversations were awkward, stilted, the words of two men who had once been close, but who had grown apart in ways that could not be bridged. On his final visit, Speer reportedly confessed his sabotage. He told Hitler that he had disobeyed the Nero Decree, that he had preserved infrastructure that Hitler had ordered destroyed. He expected rage, possibly a death sentence. Instead, Hitler responded with something like resignation. The betrayal was just one more in a series of betrayals, one more piece of evidence that everyone had failed him. Speer left Berlin that night, flying out in a small aircraft that threaded between Soviet anti-aircraft batteries. He would survive the war, stand trial at Nuremberg, serve 20 years in Spandau prison, and spend the rest of his life wrestling with his complicity in the crimes of the regime he had served. He never saw Hitler again. The military situation by mid-April was catastrophic beyond any possibility of recovery. Soviet forces had broken through the German defenses at the Silo Heights after 4 days of savage fighting. The last coherent defensive line east of Berlin had been shattered, and Red Army troops were now advancing through the eastern suburbs of the city. The sound of artillery, Soviet artillery, could be heard in the bunker, a constant reminder that the enemy was closing in. To the south, Marshal Konev's forces were sweeping around Berlin, threatening to complete an encirclement that would trap the city's defenders. To the north, other Soviet units were advancing toward the Baltic Sea, cutting off any possibility of retreat or reinforcement from that direction. The defenders of Berlin numbered perhaps 100,000 soldiers, though the term soldiers applied loosely to many of them. There were regular Wehrmacht troops, remnants of divisions that had been shattered in earlier fighting. There were Waffen-SS units, fanatical volunteers who were committed to fighting to the end. There were Volkssturm militia, old men and young boys conscripted into service in the war's final months, given minimal training and obsolete weapons. There were Hitler Youth auxiliaries, children as young as 12 who had been pressed into combat roles. Against this motley force stood more than 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces and aircraft. The numerical disparity was so extreme that meaningful resistance was impossible. Berlin could not be held. The only questions were how long it would take to fall and how many people would die in the process. Hitler continued to issue orders as though none of this mattered. He demanded counterattacks by armies that existed only on paper, their unit designations still appearing on maps while their actual soldiers were dead or captured or scattered. He insisted that divisions hold positions that had already been overrun, apparently unaware or uncaring that his orders could not be executed. He planned operations that assumed the availability of troops, weapons, and supplies that had ceased to exist. His generals listened, nodded, saluted, and returned to their posts to do what they could, which was almost nothing. They had learned that arguing with Hitler was futile. He did not respond to facts or evidence. He did not modify his views based on reality. He simply raged at anyone who contradicted him, accusing them of treason, cowardice, defeatism. The only safe course was to accept his orders and then fail to execute them, blaming circumstances rather than challenging the orders themselves. It was a pattern that had developed over years, a culture of deception and evasion that allowed the regime to function even as its leader lost contact with reality. On April 20, Hitler's birthday, the Soviet offensive reached a new intensity. Marshal Zhukov's forces, advancing from the east, launched attacks across the entire front. Soviet artillery pounded German positions with a barrage of unprecedented ferocity. Soviet tanks broke through weakened defensive lines at multiple points. Soviet infantry advanced through the suburbs, fighting house to house, street to street, reducing German resistance one strongpoint at a time. The birthday celebrations in the bunker were surreal, a festival of denial in the midst of catastrophe. Hitler received congratulations from his staff, from visiting officials, from generals who had come to pay their respects before returning to positions that might be overrun before nightfall. There was champagne, there were speeches, there was the ceremony in the Chancellery garden, Hitler reviewing the Hitler Youth, pinning medals on children who would be dead within days. And then, in the afternoon, Hitler held a final conference with his military commanders. The meeting was attended by the senior leadership of what remained of the German military: Goering, Dönitz, Keitel, Jodl, Bormann, and others. Hitler presided, as he always presided, but his demeanor was different from previous conferences. He seemed withdrawn, almost detached, as though he were observing the proceedings from a great distance. The discussion focused on the military options that remained. Some commanders argued for a breakout, an attempt to move the government south, to Bavaria or Austria, where resistance might continue from mountain strongholds. Others argued for a last stand in Berlin, a Wagnerian finale that would at least provide a heroic narrative for future generations. Hitler made his decision. He would remain in Berlin. He would take personal command of the defense. He would not flee, would not surrender, would not give his enemies the satisfaction of capturing him. He would stay until the end and then take his own life rather than fall into enemy hands. The decision was presented as strategic, but it was really psychological. Hitler could not face the reality of defeat. He could not accept that his choices had led to catastrophe. He could not imagine a future in which he was a prisoner, a defendant, a humiliated remnant of destroyed power. Death was preferable. Death in Berlin, in the capital of his Reich, at the center of his empire, that death would at least have meaning, would at least fit the narrative he had constructed for himself. It would be a hero's death, a martyr's death, a death that future generations would remember and honor. Or so he believed. In reality, his death would be squalid and small, a suicide in a concrete bunker while the world burned above him. There would be no heroism, no martyrdom, only the end of a man who had caused more suffering than almost any other individual in human history. The conference ended with the dispersal of the Nazi leadership. Goering left for Bavaria, ostensibly to coordinate the defense of southern Germany. Dönitz left for the north, to take command of naval operations and whatever forces remained in that sector. Others scattered to various destinations, each pursuing their own survival strategies as the Reich collapsed around them. Hitler remained in the bunker with his inner circle. Eva Braun, Goebbels and his family, Bormann, and the military and administrative staff who had nowhere else to go. The final act was about to begin. On April 22, Hitler confronted reality for the first time and broke completely under the weight of what he saw. The military conference that day began like any other. Officers presented their reports on the current situation. The news was uniformly grim. Soviet forces had penetrated the northern suburbs, street fighting was spreading, the encirclement of the city was nearly complete. Hitler listened with growing agitation. His hand trembled more than usual. His face flushed, then went pale. When the briefer finished his report, Hitler demanded news of a counterattack he had ordered the previous day. The attack was to be led by SS General Felix Steiner, using forces assembled north of Berlin. Steiner's attack, Hitler believed, would strike the Soviet flank, relieve pressure on the city, change the entire character of the battle. There was a long pause. The officers exchanged glances. Finally, someone explained that Steiner had not attacked. The forces assigned to him did not exist in the strength Hitler had assumed. Some units had been destroyed. Others had never reached their assembly areas. The attack had never been possible. Hitler's response was unlike anything the witnesses had ever seen. He ordered everyone, except his closest aides, to leave the conference room. Then, in front of Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, Bergdorf, and Bormann, he erupted into a rage that exceeded anything in his history of rages. He screamed that the war was lost. He screamed that he had been betrayed by everyone: the army, the SS, the party, the German people. He cursed the generals who had failed him, the soldiers who had proved unworthy, the nation that had not deserved his leadership. He accused everyone of lying to him, of deceiving him, of deliberately sabotaging the war effort. He declared that he was surrounded by traitors and incompetents, that no one could be trusted, that he alone had remained faithful to the cause while everyone else had abandoned it. He wept. The Führer of the Greater German Reich, the man who had commanded the largest military operation in history, stood in his bunker and wept like a child. Tears streamed down his face. His body shook with sobs. The image of strength and certainty that he had projected for decades dissolved into the reality of a broken man facing the consequences of his choices. He declared that he would remain in Berlin and die with the city. He would not flee, would not compromise, would not give his enemies the victory of capturing him alive. He would stay until the end and then kill himself, and everyone who had failed him could face the consequences of their failure without him. He demanded that others join him in death. If their loyalty meant anything, They would die alongside him rather than survive into a world that had rejected everything they believed in. The witnesses stood in shocked silence, unsure how to respond, afraid to speak, afraid even to move. The breakdown continued for hours. Hitler alternated between screaming and sobbing, between accusations and self-pity, between rage at others and despair at his own situation. The emotional intensity was exhausting for everyone present, and yet no one could leave, no one could suggest that the Führer might want to rest. No one could do anything except wait for the storm to pass. Eventually, it did pass. Hitler's voice grew hoarse. His energy was spent. He retreated to his private quarters, leaving his generals to contemplate what they had witnessed. The Führer had admitted defeat. For the first time in his political career, he had acknowledged that he could not win, that his plans had failed, that the future he had promised was not going to come. The acknowledgement changed nothing about the military situation. The Soviets continued to advance whether Hitler acknowledged it or not, but it changed everything about the atmosphere in the bunker. The pretense of possible victory was gone. Everyone now knew that they were waiting for the end. The days that followed were a strange mixture of routine and crisis. The military briefings continued, though they had become almost meaningless. Officers reported on positions that were being overrun, on units that were being destroyed, on a defense that was collapsing faster than anyone could track. Hitler listened, occasionally issued orders, occasionally raged at failures that were inevitable. But the intensity was gone. He seemed exhausted, depleted, a man going through motions that no longer mattered. The bunker settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of a death watch. People ate meals, held conversations, tried to sleep despite the constant shelling. They waited for news, though news was almost always bad. They waited for the end, though no one knew exactly when or how the end would come. Outside, the battle for Berlin raged with increasing fury. Soviet forces had completed their encirclement of the city on April 25, cutting off any possibility of retreat or reinforcement. The defenders were now fighting in isolation, with no hope of relief, no supplies except what they had on hand, no future except death or capture. The fighting moved through the city block by block, building by building, room by room. It was urban combat of the most brutal and intimate kind, soldiers facing each other at distances measured in meters, killing with rifles and grenades and knives and bare hands. The destruction was total. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Fires burned unchecked because there was no water pressure to fight them, no firefighters available, no one with time or energy to do anything except fight and survive. The civilian population suffered along with the soldiers. Those who couldn't flee, the elderly, the sick, families with young children, sheltered in basements and cellars while the battle raged above them. Many died from shelling, from building collapses, from fires that swept through their shelters. Others emerged to find themselves in Soviet-controlled territory, facing the consequences of conquest. For women, those consequences were particularly severe. The behavior of Soviet troops toward German women in the conquered territories had been documented throughout the advance from the east. Mass rape was not an exception, but a pattern, a tool of terror and revenge that accompanied the Red Army wherever it went. In Berlin, the pattern would continue. Thousands of women would be assaulted in the days and weeks following the city's fall. This knowledge hung over the bunker, unspoken but present. The women there, Eva Braun, Magda Goebbels, the secretaries and nurses who had remained, knew what might await them if they fell into Soviet hands. Some had obtained cyanide capsules, planning to kill themselves rather than be captured. Others hoped that somehow they might escape, might reach the Western Allies, might find safety that did not exist. The men knew too, and their knowledge shaped their decisions. Those who chose to die with Hitler did so in part because they feared what would happen if they surrendered. Death by their own hand seemed preferable to death by Soviet execution, or to the torture and humiliation that might precede execution. It was a rational calculation based on irrational circumstances. The regime that had terrorized millions was now experiencing terror itself, reaping what it had sown, facing the consequences of the cruelties it had inflicted on others. On April 23, the first of the great betrayals reached the bunker. Hermann Göring, the Reich Marshal who had fled Berlin 3 days earlier, sent a telegram from Bavaria. The message was carefully worded, respectful in tone, loyal in language, but its content was explosive. Göring referenced the 1941 decree that designated him as Hitler's successor if the Führer ever became incapacitated or unable to exercise his functions. Given that Hitler was now trapped in Berlin, cut off from most of Germany, arguably incapacitated by circumstances if not by health, Göring proposed that Göring, assume leadership of the Reich. The telegram gave Hitler until a specified time to respond. If no response was received, Göring would assume that the Führer concurred with the transfer of power. It was not, technically, a power grab. Göring was invoking a legal provision that Hitler himself had established. He was offering to take over only if Hitler was unable to continue. He was giving Hitler the opportunity to refuse, but Hitler did not see it that way. He saw only betrayal, his designated successor abandoning him, presuming to take power while he was still alive, setting a deadline that amounted to an ultimatum. The careful wording of the telegram meant nothing. The intent was clear. Göring wanted to replace him. The rage that followed was extreme even by Hitler's standards. He stripped Göring of all his offices, expelled him from the Nazi Party, ordered his arrest for treason. SS troops in Bavaria were dispatched to take Göring into custody, where he would remain for the rest of the war. It was the end of a relationship that had lasted more than 20 years, since the earliest days of the Nazi movement. Göring had been with Hitler at the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923, had been wounded in that failed uprising, had remained loyal through the years in the wilderness and the rise to power and the conquest of Europe. Now he was a traitor, dismissed with contempt, his career ended by a telegram that had probably been meant as a gesture of loyalty rather than rebellion. The truth was more complicated than Hitler's reaction suggested. Göring was not trying to seize power. He was trying to preserve continuity, to ensure that the Reich had functioning leadership even if Hitler was incapacitated. His timing was poor, his wording was unfortunate, but his intentions were probably not treasonous. But in the atmosphere of the bunker, with Hitler's paranoia at its peak, any ambiguity was interpreted as betrayal. Göring's fall was swift and complete, a warning to anyone else who might consider asserting independence from the Führer. Heinrich Himmler's betrayal came next, and it was far more deliberate than Göring's. Himmler was the head of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust, one of the most powerful and feared men in Nazi Germany. His organization controlled the concentration camps, the police, the security services, the elite military units of the Waffen-SS. He had built an empire within the empire, a state within the state. Since early 1945, Himmler had been conducting secret negotiations with the Western Allies through intermediaries. He believed, or wanted to believe, that the Americans and British would see him as a valuable partner in the coming struggle against Soviet communism. If he could deliver a German surrender in the West, perhaps he could save himself and preserve some of his power. The negotiations were conducted through Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish diplomat who served as vice president of the Swedish Red Cross. Himmler met with Bernadotte multiple times in April, offering to surrender German forces in the West while continuing to fight the Soviets in the East. The offer was rejected. The Allies were committed to unconditional surrender on all fronts, and they had no interest in making deals with the man who had overseen the murder of millions. But Himmler continued to negotiate, hoping that circumstances might change, that desperation might overcome principle. On April 28, word of Himmler's contacts reached the bunker. A BBC broadcast reported that Himmler had offered to surrender to the Western Allies. The story was picked up by news agencies around the world. Within hours, everyone knew. Hitler's reaction to this betrayal was even more extreme than his reaction to Göring's telegram. This was not ambiguity or poor wording. This was the head of the SS, the organization that was supposed to be the guardian of Nazi ideals, the embodiment of loyalty to the Führer, negotiating with the enemy behind Hitler's back. It was treason of the most fundamental kind, the ultimate repudiation of everything the regime claimed to stand for. Hitler expelled Himmler from the party and from all his offices. He ordered Himmler's arrest, though there was no one capable of arresting the head of the SS. He raged about betrayal and treachery and the faithlessness of everyone around him. But there was something else in his reaction, something beyond rage. There was a kind of grim validation, a satisfaction that his darkest suspicions had been confirmed. He had always believed that he was surrounded by weaklings and traitors, that he alone was truly committed to the cause. Now Goering and Himmler had proved him right. The betrayals were not his failure. They were his vindication. He had been right all along, and everyone else had been wrong. It was a twisted form of consolation, but it was the only consolation available to a man whose world was collapsing around him. In the midst of the betrayals and the battles, in the chaos of the bunker's final days, Hitler made a decision that surprised everyone, including, perhaps, himself. He would marry Eva Braun. The decision came on April 28, announced suddenly and without apparent preparation. Hitler summoned a city official named Walter Wagner, a minor bureaucrat who had been organizing civilian defense efforts in the government district, and informed him that he was to perform a civil marriage ceremony immediately. Wagner was bewildered. He had no idea that Hitler had a companion, let alone that he intended to marry her. But one did not question the Führer's orders. He gathered the necessary paperwork, reviewed the legal requirements, and prepared to perform the ceremony. The wedding took place just before midnight on April 28-29 in the bunker's small conference room. The setting was as far from a traditional wedding as could be imagined. The room was cramped, lit by bare electric bulbs, its walls bare concrete. There were no flowers, no decorations, no music, no guests beyond the small group of witnesses required by law. The bride wore a black silk dress, one of the few garments she had brought to the bunker that was appropriate for the occasion, though black was not traditional for weddings. The groom wore his standard military uniform, the grey jacket and black trousers he had worn through countless meetings and conferences and speeches. The witnesses were Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, representing the political and administrative sides of the regime. A few others were present, Hitler's secretaries, some military aides. But the gathering was small, intimate in a way that weddings should be intimate, but that seemed strange given the participants. Wagner read the standard civil marriage service, making the necessary modifications for wartime conditions. He asked the required questions about Aryan blood and hereditary disease, questions that were mandatory for German marriages, part of the racial laws that the regime had imposed on the nation it ruled. Hitler and Eva answered in the affirmative, confirming their racial purity, even as the racial state they had built was being destroyed above them. When Wagner asked if they took each other as husband and wife, they said yes. When he pronounced them married, Eva reportedly began to cry. She had waited 15 years for this moment. She had accepted secrecy, invisibility, a relationship that gave her nothing except the privilege of being near a man she loved. Now, finally, she was his wife. She was Eva Hitler. The irony was not lost on anyone present. The wedding was a gesture of commitment, of love, of hope for a future together. But there was no future. Both bride and groom knew they would be dead within days, perhaps within hours. The marriage they had just entered would be measured not in years or decades, but in hours, about 40 hours, as it would turn out. After the ceremony, there was champagne and cake in the bunker's common area. Guests offered congratulations. The bride and groom received well wishes for an hour or two. The atmosphere was almost normal, almost festive, as though the bunker were hosting an ordinary celebration rather than a prelude to murder and suicide. Then the party ended, and reality returned. Hitler withdrew to his private quarters, where he spent much of April 29 dictating two documents that would serve as his final statement to history. The first was his political testament, a lengthy statement of his ideology and his interpretation of the war and its causes. The document was rambling and repetitive, covering ground that Hitler had covered countless times before. The Jews were responsible for the war. Germany had been stabbed in the back. The generals had failed him. The German people would have triumphed if only they had been worthy of his leadership. There was no acknowledgement of error, no admission of responsibility for the catastrophe that his decisions had created. Hitler went to his death, convinced that he had been right about everything, right about the Jewish conspiracy, right about the need for living space in the East, right about the strategies and tactics that had led to defeat. If Germany had lost the war, it was because others had failed him, not because he had failed Germany. The testament named his successors: Admiral Dönitz as President and Supreme Commander, Goebbels as Chancellor. A new cabinet was listed, though most of its members would never serve. The government Hitler was creating existed only on paper, a fiction that would be swept away by the reality of unconditional surrender. But the act of naming successors mattered to Hitler. It allowed him to believe that his movement would survive his death, that National Socialism would continue even if he did not. The testament was less a practical document than a psychological one, an attempt to impose meaning on a situation that had become meaningless. The second document was Hitler's personal will, much shorter and more focused. He left his possessions to the Nazi Party, or if the party ceased to exist, to the German state. The possessions were negligible. Hitler had never accumulated personal wealth in the conventional sense, but the gesture was symbolic, a final demonstration of his identification with the cause. He explained his decision to remain in Berlin and die rather than flee. He would not be displayed in a Jewish-organized show trial. He would not give his enemies the satisfaction of capturing him alive. He would die on his own terms, in his own capital, by his own hand. He announced his marriage to Eva Braun and stated that they had chosen death together. She had wanted to share his fate, and he was honoring that wish. They would die as husband and wife, a final affirmation of the relationship they had hidden for so many years. The documents were signed and witnessed. Copies were entrusted to messengers who would attempt to carry them out of Berlin to preserve them for history. The originals would remain in the bunker. That evening, Hitler learned that Mussolini was dead. The Italian dictator had been captured by partisans while trying to flee to Switzerland. He and his mistress, Clara Petacci, had been executed by firing squad on April 28. Their bodies had been transported to Milan and hung upside down from a metal girder at a gas station, where crowds had gathered to beat and mutilate them. Photographs of the scene were circulating worldwide. They showed Mussolini hanging by his heels, his face battered beyond recognition, his body stripped and degraded by the people he had once ruled. Hitler was reportedly deeply affected by this news. His fear of a similar fate, of being captured, displayed, humiliated, had always been present. Now he had seen what that fate looked like. He gave detailed instructions for the disposal of his own body. It must be burned completely, reduced to ash and fragments that the Soviets could not recover. There must be nothing left to parade or photograph or hang from girders. His body must simply cease to exist. He would not be Mussolini. He would not be a trophy. He would disappear, leaving nothing behind except words and memories and the aftermath of the catastrophe he had created. April 30, 1945, was the final day. Hitler rose late, as always, emerging from his bedroom sometime around noon. He was informed that Soviet forces had reached the Potsdamer Platz, less than 500 meters from the bunker entrance. The Reich Chancellery above was under direct assault. Fighting could be heard even through the bunker's thick concrete walls. The end had arrived. Hitler ate lunch with his secretaries, Traudl Jung and Gerda Christian. The meal was simple, spaghetti with tomato sauce, the kind of bland food his damaged digestion could tolerate. The conversation was subdued. Everyone knew what was coming. After lunch, Hitler made his farewells to the staff. He walked through the bunker corridors, shaking hands with secretaries and servants and guards. He thanked them for their service. He gave instructions for their escape. There was still time, perhaps, to slip out through the chaos above and find a way through Soviet lines. He distributed cyanide capsules to those who wanted them. The capsules had been tested on Blondie, Hitler's German shepherd dog, to ensure they worked. Blondie had died quickly, confirming that the poison was effective. Now the same poison was being handed out to humans who might choose to use it. Hitler gave his valet, Heinz Linge, final instructions for disposing of the bodies. After the deaths, Linge was to enter the private quarters, wrap the bodies in blankets, carry them to the garden above, and burn them. Gasoline had been stockpiled for this purpose, 200 liters, enough to ensure complete cremation. The instructions were detailed, practical, the kind of instructions one might give for any household task. Burn the bodies, make sure nothing remains. Don't let the Soviets have anything to display. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to their private suite. The suite consisted of a sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small dressing room. It was cramped and utilitarian, like everything in the bunker. Bare concrete walls, minimal furniture, no windows, no natural light. It was not a grand setting for a death scene. It was simply the place where Hitler happened to be when his time ran out. Eva wore a dark blue dress with white collar and cuffs. Her hair was done, her makeup applied, her appearance carefully arranged. Even at the end, she maintained the standards of grooming that had characterized her time in the bunker. Hitler wore his uniform, the grey jacket, the black trousers, the Iron Cross he had earned in the First World War. He had worn this uniform for years, through victories and defeats, through speeches and meetings, and the endless conferences that had marked his leadership. He would die in it. They sat together on a small sofa in the sitting room. The door was closed behind them. What happened next was reconstructed from testimony given by those who waited in the corridor, Linge, Bormann, others who were present, but who did not witness the actual deaths. Eva took cyanide. She bit down on the capsule, releasing the potassium cyanide that it contained. The poison worked quickly, disrupting the body's ability to use oxygen, producing unconsciousness within seconds and death within minutes. She died without visible struggle, simply slumping against Hitler's shoulder as the poison took effect. Hitler also took cyanide, but he was not willing to rely on poison alone. There were too many ways that poison could fail: a defective capsule, an insufficient dose, the body's resistance to the chemical. He wanted certainty, so he shot himself as well. He placed the barrel of his Walther PPK pistol against his right temple and pulled the trigger. The bullet entered his skull, passed through his brain, and exited on the opposite side. Death was instantaneous. The sound of the gunshot was heard by those waiting in the corridor. They knew immediately what it meant. After a pause, accounts differ on the length, ranging from a few minutes to half an hour, Linge and Bormann entered the private quarters. They found Hitler slumped on the sofa, blood pooling from the wound in his head. The pistol lay on the floor beside him. Eva sat next to him, her head against his shoulder, unmarked by any visible wound. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the bitter almond scent of cyanide. The Führer of the Greater German Reich was dead. The body of the most powerful dictator of the 20th century was wrapped in an army blanket and carried up the bunker stairs by his valet and his butler. It was an ignominious procession. 2 servants hauling a corpse through concrete corridors, past guards who stood aside, past staff who watched in silence. The man who had commanded armies, who had reshaped the map of Europe, who had sent millions to their deaths, was now just a body to be disposed of. Eva's body followed, carried by 2 SS officers. She was lighter, easier to handle, wrapped in a blanket that concealed the face that had watched Hitler for 15 years and was now fixed forever in death. The procession emerged into the garden of the Reich Chancellery. The garden was a battlefield. Artillery shells had cratered the ground, destroyed the landscaping, torn holes in the walls of the Chancellery itself. The building that had once been the architectural expression of Nazi power was now a ruin. Its grand halls collapsed, its imposing facades shattered by bombardment. Soviet troops were visible in the distance. The front line was perhaps 300 meters away, close enough that the mourners in the garden were exposed to sniper fire. They worked quickly, aware that every moment in the open was dangerous. A shallow trench had been dug near the bunker exit. The bodies were placed in the trench, side by side, the blankets arranged to provide what dignity was possible in the circumstances. Gasoline was poured over the corpses. Can after can, 200 liters in total, soaking the cloth, pooling in the trench around the bodies. The smell of gasoline mixed with the smell of explosives and burning buildings that pervaded the entire city. The mourners retreated to the bunker entrance. Soviet shells were falling nearby, too close for safety. Someone, accounts differ as to who, threw a burning rag into the trench. The gasoline ignited with a roar. A pillar of flame rose from the pit, orange and yellow against the grey smoke that covered the sky. The bodies burned, cloth first, then hair, then skin, then the tissues beneath. The heat was intense, the flames reaching several meters into the air. Those watching from the bunker entrance raised their arms in the Nazi salute. It was the gesture they had made thousands of times, at rallies and meetings and ceremonies. Now they made it one last time, for a leader who could no longer see it, whose body was being consumed by flames that would leave nothing behind. The cremation took several hours, with additional gasoline poured on periodically to keep the fire burning. When it finally subsided, little remained: charred bones, fragments of skull, ashes that mixed with the earth of the garden. Soviet troops would later recover some of these fragments. They would examine them, photograph them, preserve them as evidence that Hitler was truly dead. But the cremation had done its work. There would be no body to display, no corpse to hang from a girder, no trophy for the victors. Hitler had achieved his final objective. He had denied his enemies even the satisfaction of possessing his remains. The deaths of Hitler and Eva did not end the horror in the bunker. Joseph Goebbels, who had named himself Chancellor in Hitler's testament, now faced his own final decision. He had no intention of surviving. Unlike the other Nazi leaders who were fleeing or negotiating or trying to escape, Goebbels had made his commitment to death absolute. He would die with Hitler, die with the Reich, die as a martyr to the cause he had served with such fanatical devotion. But first, there was the matter of his children. The 6 Goebbels' children, Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, were still in the bunker. They had spent the past days playing in the corridors, having their hair braided by Eva Braun, watching movies in the small projection room, apparently oblivious to the catastrophe unfolding around them. Helga, the eldest at 12, may have understood more than her siblings. She was old enough to sense that something was terribly wrong, old enough to read the fear and despair in the faces of the adults around her. But even she probably did not understand what her parents had decided. Magda Goebbels had made her choice. She would not allow her children to survive into a world without National Socialism. She could not bear the thought of them growing up under foreign occupation, despised for their father's role in the regime, stripped of everything they had been raised to believe. Better that they should die now, innocent and pure, than live in the corrupt world that was coming. It was a monstrous calculation, the logic of fanaticism carried to its ultimate conclusion. But Magda believed it. She believed it deeply enough to kill her own children. On May 1, she put her plan into action. The children were told it was time for their medicine, the injections that would help them sleep. They accepted this explanation without question. Children trust their parents, trust that adults know best, trust that they are being cared for rather than murdered. The bunker's doctor, Ludwig Stumpfegger, administered morphine injections to each child. The drug put them to sleep, rendered them unconscious, made them unaware of what would happen next. Once they were unconscious, Magda, or Stumpfegger, acting on her orders, crushed cyanide capsules in their mouths. The poison worked quickly. One by one, the children died: Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, Heidrun. The oldest was 12. The youngest was 4. They died in their beds, in the bunker where they had played, killed by the parents who should have protected them. The bodies were left where they lay, arranged as though they were peacefully sleeping. Magda had dressed them in white nightgowns. Their hair had been brushed and braided. They looked like sleeping angels, except that they would never wake up. Magda then joined her husband in the bunker garden. The exact sequence of their deaths is uncertain. Some accounts say they took cyanide together. Others say Magda took cyanide first, and then Goebbels shot her before shooting himself. Still others say that SS orderlies shot them both after they had taken poison to ensure that they were truly dead. What is certain is that both Joseph and Magda Goebbels died in the garden on the evening of May 1, and that their bodies were burned, though not as thoroughly as Hitler's, because there was less gasoline available and less time to complete the cremation. Soviet troops would later find their partially burned remains near the bunker entrance, along with the bodies of the 6 children inside. Why did Magda Goebbels murder her own children? The question has no satisfying answer. Some historians see her action as the ultimate expression of Nazi fanaticism, a woman so completely committed to the ideology that she could not conceive of her children living without it, even though the children themselves had no understanding of ideology and no capacity to choose. Others interpret it as a twisted form of maternal love, a mother who believed, however wrongly, that she was protecting her children from a fate worse than death, sparing them suffering that she could not bear to imagine. Perhaps there is truth in both interpretations. Perhaps Magda Goebbels was both a fanatic and a mother, and the two identities combined to produce an action that neither alone would have produced. Or perhaps there is no explanation that can make sense of such an act. Some things are beyond understanding. Some things should be beyond understanding. The murder of the Goebbels children remains one of the most disturbing events in a history filled with disturbing events. 6 young lives, extinguished by the people who should have loved them most, sacrificed to an ideology that had already killed millions. Martin Bormann tried to escape. Unlike Goebbels, Bormann had no intention of dying with Hitler. He was a survivor, a man who had built his power through cunning and manipulation, and he believed that he could survive this final catastrophe as he had survived so many others. On the night of May 1-2, he joined a group of bunker personnel attempting to break out through Soviet lines. The plan was to move north through the city, avoiding the main Soviet concentrations, and eventually reach German forces that were still fighting in Holstein. The breakout was chaos. Soviet troops were everywhere. The streets were blocked with rubble, patrolled by enemy soldiers, illuminated by fires that burned throughout the city. The escape party fragmented almost immediately, small groups scattering through the ruins, each trying to find its own path to safety. Bormann's fate remained a mystery for decades. Some witnesses claim to have seen him killed during the breakout, hit by a shell, shot by Soviet soldiers, poisoned when escape became impossible. Others believed he had survived, had made it out of Berlin, had escaped to South America or some other refuge. The Nuremberg tribunal tried Bormann in absentia in 1945-46, sentencing him to death for crimes against humanity. But without a body, without definitive proof of death, rumors persisted that he was still alive, still hiding, still waiting for an opportunity to resurface. The mystery was finally resolved in 1972, when construction workers in Berlin discovered human remains near the Leiter station, close to the area where the breakout attempt had occurred. Forensic examination identified the remains as probably belonging to Bormann. The cause of death was cyanide poisoning. DNA analysis in 1998 confirmed the identification. Martin Bormann, the most powerful Nazi never captured by the Allies, had died within hours of leaving the bunker, just another corpse in a city that was carpeted with them. He had taken poison when escape became impossible, the same choice that so many others had made, the same final exit that seemed preferable to falling into enemy hands. The bunker itself fell to Soviet forces on May 2. Red Army soldiers swept through the underground complex, moving cautiously through corridors they expected to be booby-trapped. They found abandoned equipment, scattered documents, the detritus of a command post that had ceased to function. They found the rooms where Hitler and Eva had lived, now empty of bodies. They found the room where the Goebbels children had died, their small corpses still arranged in their beds. In the garden, they found the remains of the cremations, charred bones and ashes, barely recognizable as human. Soviet investigators would spend months trying to identify these remains, piecing together evidence that would confirm Hitler's death. The identification process was complicated by Soviet secrecy. Stalin initially suppressed information about Hitler's death, possibly because he wanted to use the possibility that Hitler had escaped as a bargaining chip in negotiations with the Western Allies. For years, the Soviet government claimed uncertainty about whether Hitler was really dead, fueling conspiracy theories that would persist for decades. The truth was simpler. Hitler had died in the bunker on April 30, killed by his own hand, burned in the garden by his own orders. The Soviets recovered what remained: a jaw fragment, a piece of skull, dental records that confirmed the identification. The evidence was conclusive, even if it was not made public for many years. The bunker was partially destroyed by Soviet engineers in 1947. They planted explosives, hoping to demolish the complex completely, to eliminate any possibility that it might become a shrine or a pilgrimage site. But the thick concrete resisted their efforts. The bunker cracked and sagged, but did not collapse. Over the following decades, the site was buried under new construction. East Berlin, controlled by the communist government, had no interest in preserving or acknowledging Nazi heritage. The bunker's location was deliberately obscured, built over with a parking lot and nondescript buildings. Today, a simple information board marks the approximate location of the bunker entrance. There is no monument, no museum, no elaborate memorial. German authorities made a deliberate decision not to create any site that might attract neo-Nazi sympathizers. The bunker itself remains buried, slowly deteriorating, its chambers flooding with groundwater, its concrete walls cracking under pressures they were never designed to endure. It is a hidden tomb for no one, empty and forgotten, irrelevant to a city that has moved on. The story of Hitler's final days has been told countless times, in books and films and documentaries and dramatic reconstructions. Each retelling emphasizes different elements: the military collapse, the personal relationships, the psychological disintegration, the crimes committed as the regime died. Historians debate the details. Psychologists analyze the behaviors. Filmmakers dramatize the scenes. The bunker has become a metaphor for the end of tyranny, a symbol of how dictatorships die. But certain truths remain constant across all interpretations. The end was not heroic. It was not the Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, that Nazi mythology had invoked. It was squalid and small, a suicide in a concrete room, a cremation in a bomb-cratered garden, the murder of children by their own parents. The people in the bunker were not gods or demons. They were human beings, flawed, frightened, fanatical, but human. They made choices that led them to that place at that time, choices that we can analyze and condemn, but perhaps never fully understand. Hitler died blaming everyone but himself. He believed to the end that he had been right, that others had failed him, that his vision was correct, even if the world had rejected it. He took no responsibility for the millions of deaths his decisions had caused, for the destruction of Germany, for the Holocaust, for any of it. Goebbels died having murdered his own children. He believed he was protecting them from a world he found intolerable, saving them from fates worse than death. The children had no say in the matter. Eva Braun died for love, or for what she believed was love, a devotion that had brought her nothing but secrecy and invisibility, and finally, about 40 hours of marriage before she died. Bormann died trying to escape, faithful to his own survival, even at the end. He had never believed in anything except power and self-preservation, and his final act was consistent with everything that had come before. Above them, Berlin burned. The city that was to have been Germania, the world capital of a 1,000-year empire, was being reduced to rubble by Soviet artillery and street fighting. The people of Berlin, the German civilians who had supported Hitler or tolerated him or simply been unable to escape him, died by the thousands in the battle for the city. 60 million people died in World War II.